Imagine being forced from your home, dragged to the center of town, and locked into a wooden cage while hundreds of your neighbors gather around. They're not there to rescue you, they're there to watch, to jeer, to throw rotten vegetables at your face, your crime. Perhaps you gossiped about a neighbor. Maybe you got drunk on a Sunday. Or perhaps you stole a loaf of bread to feed your starving family. Now imagine the same town square, but this time the crowd has gathered for something far more grim, a public hanging. Men, women, even children press forward to witness a human being's final moments. Ministers deliver sermons about sin and salvation. The condemned's last words echo across the silent crowd. And then, the trap door opens. This was justice in colonial America, loud, visible, and deliberately designed to traumatize witnesses. Punishment wasn't something that happened behind closed doors. It was theater, spectacle, and community ritual all rolled into one brutal package. But why? Why did colonial authorities insist that justice be performed in full public view? The answer reveals something profound about how early Americans understood crime, community, and social control. Historical context and background. To understand why colonial punishments were public spectacles, we must first grasp the unique social, economic, and philosophical landscape of colonial America from roughly 1607 through the late 1700s. Colonial society was fundamentally different from modern America in several crucial ways. First, communities were small and tightly knit. Even the largest colonial cities were modest by today's standards. Boston had only about 16,000 residents by 1750, Philadelphia around 18,000. Most colonists lived in small towns or on scattered farms where everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. Your reputation was your most valuable asset, and reputation was public knowledge, built and destroyed through community observation and gossip. Second, colonial justice systems operated with minimal infrastructure. There were no state penitentiaries for most of the colonial period. The first American prison designed for long-term incarceration wasn't built until 1773, the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia. County jails existed, but they served primarily as holding facilities for people awaiting trial or those who couldn't pay debts, not as punishment venues. The concept of rehabilitation through incarceration didn't exist. When someone was convicted of a crime, authorities needed punishment options that were immediate, visible, and didn't require expensive long-term facilities. Third, colonial legal philosophy was deeply rooted in both English common law and Puritan religious thought, particularly in New England. English law tradition included extensive use of public corporal punishment and capital punishment for a wide range of offenses. The Bloody Code of 18th-century England prescribed death for over 200 crimes, from murder to stealing turnips. Colonists brought these traditions with them, though they often applied them somewhat less severely than in England. Puritan theology added another layer to punishment philosophy. Puritans believed that sin was both a private offense against God and a public contamination that threatened the entire community's relationship with the divine. Crime, as a manifestation of sin, therefore required public acknowledgement, public punishment, and public repentance. The community needed to collectively witness the criminal's suffering and ideally their repentance, to purge the sin from the community and restore social and spiritual order. Fourth, colonial economies were predominantly agricultural and cash poor. Fines were difficult to collect when many people had little money. Imprisoning people for extended periods was expensive. Someone had to feed and guard prisoners, and keeping able-bodied workers locked up removed productive labor from communities that needed every hand. Public corporal punishment offered a solution. It was cheap, requiring only basic equipment like whipping posts or stocks. Quick, a whipping took minutes, not months, and didn't remove workers from the economy for extended periods. Fifth, communication technology was limited. There were no photographs, no television, no internet. Information spread primarily through word of mouth, and, in larger towns, through newspapers that printed irregularly and reached limited audiences. For authorities to communicate messages about law, order, and the consequences of crime, they needed dramatic, memorable events that people would witness personally and then discuss extensively. A public execution created weeks of conversation, sermons, and published last words pamphlets that spread the message far beyond those who attended. The types of crimes punished publicly varied, but generally fell into several categories. Capital crimes, murder, rape, arson, horse theft, piracy, and sometimes robbery, resulted in public execution. Property crimes like theft resulted in whipping, branding, or time in the stocks or pillory. Moral offenses, fornication, adultery, blasphemy, Sabbath breaking, public drunkenness, often resulted in public shaming through stocks, pillory, or wearing symbolic markers like scarlet letters. Disorderly conduct and contempt of authority earned time in the stocks or public whipping. The specific forms of public punishment evolved from medieval European practices. The stocks, where offenders sat with feet locked in wooden boards, and the pillory, where offenders stood with head and hands locked in boards, dated back to at least the 13th century in England. Whipping posts were ancient. Public execution methods, hanging primarily, but occasionally burning or breaking on the wheel for the most serious offenses, had deep roots in European legal tradition. Colonial authorities didn't invent these punishments, they inherited them, but they deployed them with particular intensity and purpose in the colonial context. Understanding why requires examining specific cases where public punishment was used and analyzing what these spectacles were meant to achieve and what they actually achieved in colonial communities. Case studies/real-life examples. Case Study 1. The execution of Esther Rodgers, public hanging as moral instruction, Ipswich, Massachusetts, 1701. On July 30, 1701, a massive crowd estimated at between 4,000 and 5,000 people gathered in Ipswich, Massachusetts, a town with a population of only about 2,000 residents. The crowd had swelled with visitors from Boston and surrounding communities, all coming to witness the execution of Esther Rodgers, a young woman convicted of murdering her illegitimate infant children. Esther Rodgers was a domestic servant who had become pregnant out of wedlock, a serious crime in Puritan society. Rather than face public shame, she concealed her pregnancy and, according to court testimony, murdered her newborn infant. Later evidence suggested she had done this twice. Infanticide by unmarried mothers, while not common, occurred with disturbing regularity in colonial America, driven by the devastating social consequences of bearing a child outside marriage. The execution itself was a carefully orchestrated multi-hour event designed to maximize moral instruction. It began with a procession from the jail to the gallows, with Esther riding in a cart surrounded by ministers and officials. The Reverend Cotton Mather, one of New England's most influential ministers, had spent the previous weeks visiting Esther in jail, extracting a detailed confession and guiding her toward public repentance. At the gallows, the execution paused for extensive religious exercises. Multiple ministers preached sermons about sin, redemption, and divine justice. The crowd, including many young people whom authorities particularly wanted to influence, listened to detailed accounts of Esther's crimes and the path of sin that led to them. Esther herself was given time to speak. Her last words had been carefully prepared with ministerial guidance. She confessed her sins publicly, warned young people, especially young women, against fornication and deception, and expressed hope in God's mercy for her soul. Only after hours of this religious theater did the actual execution occur. Esther was hanged, and her body was left on display for a time as a final visual warning. But the event's impact extended far beyond the execution day. Cotton Mather immediately published a pamphlet titled Warnings from the Dead, which contained Esther's confession, the minister's sermons, and explicit moral lessons drawn from the case. This pamphlet sold widely and was read in churches throughout New England, multiplying the execution's instructional impact. The Esther Rodgers execution demonstrates several key features of colonial public punishment. Publicity as deterrence. Authorities believed the sheer size and solemnity of the crowd would deter others from similar crimes. The spectacle was designed to be so memorable that anyone contemplating fornication or infanticide would remember Esther's fate. Moral and spiritual theater. The execution was framed as a spiritual event as much as a legal one. Esther's crime was presented not just as murder, but as the culmination of a series of sins. Her repentance and execution became a morality play about God's justice and mercy. Community participation. The crowd wasn't just passive observers, they were active participants in a community ritual. By witnessing the execution, they collectively affirmed community values, participated in moral instruction of their children, and symbolically purged the sin from their midst. Educational purpose. Young people's attendance was explicitly encouraged. Parents brought children to witness executions as educational experiences, to instill moral lessons and fear of transgression. The psychological trauma we would now recognize as abuse was then viewed as beneficial instruction. Media amplification. The published pamphlet extended the execution's reach far beyond those physically present, creating a permanent record that could instruct future generations. Case Study 2. The Stocks and Pillory Shaming as Social Control, Various Colonies, Typical Cases. While executions were dramatic but relatively rare, lesser punishments through stocks and pillory were common, routine occurrences in colonial town squares. These devices served a different but equally important function in colonial justice. Consider a typical case from Salem, Massachusetts, in 1672. Thomas Mall, a Quaker shopkeeper, was convicted of speaking contemptuously of magistrates and ministers, and maintaining that no Christian could bear arms. His punishment, 2 hours in the stocks, followed by a whipping of 10 stripes. On the appointed day, Mall was locked into the town stocks in the center of Salem's marketplace, the most public location possible, where people conducted business, socialized, and gathered daily. For 2 hours, Mall sat unable to move while passers-by stopped to stare, comment, and mock. Some threw garbage or rotten food. Children were encouraged to jeer at the criminal, part of their moral education. After the 2 hours, Mall was released from the stocks, tied to the whipping post, and given 10 lashes with a whip while the crowd watched. He then returned home, but his punishment continued. The social memory of his public humiliation would follow him for years. The stocks and pillory served multiple purposes, beyond simply causing physical discomfort. Immediate visibility. Unlike imprisonment, which hid criminals away, stocks and pillory displayed them prominently. Everyone passing through the town center would see the criminal and learn who had transgressed and what they had done. Social humiliation. In small communities where reputation was crucial, public humiliation could be more devastating than physical pain. The shame of being displayed in the stocks could damage social standing, business relationships, and marriage prospects for years. Community boundary enforcement. These punishments allowed the community to actively participate in defining acceptable behavior. By mocking those in the stocks, community members collectively affirmed social norms and marked the transgressor as outside acceptable society. Economic efficiency. Stocks and pillory required minimal resources, just wooden structures that could last for decades. The punishment was brief, allowing the offender to return quickly to productive work while still experiencing significant consequences. Scalability. These punishments could be calibrated. Someone might spend 1 hour or 8 hours in the stocks, depending on the severity of their offense. This flexibility made them useful for a wide range of crimes. A particularly vivid example comes from a 1639 Maryland case, where a woman named Mary Bradnox was placed in the pillory for scandalous speeches. The court record notes that she was pelted with rotten eggs and vegetables for 3 hours, and that the magistrate specifically encouraged this, viewing community participation in the humiliation as essential to the punishment's effectiveness. Case Study 3. The Branding and Cropping of James Naylor Permanent Marking, Boston, 1656. Some public punishments left permanent physical marks, ensuring that the criminal's transgression would be visible for their entire life. The case of James Naylor, a Quaker preacher, illustrates this brutal practice. Naylor was convicted in Boston of blasphemy and religious dissent. His punishment, carried out in 1656, was designed to be both immediately instructive and permanently marking. First, he was whipped through the streets, tied to the back of a cart and lashed repeatedly as the cart moved slowly through town, maximizing both his suffering and public visibility. Then, he was brought to the town center where a heated iron brand was used to mark his forehead with the letter B for blasphemer. Finally, his tongue was bored through with a hot iron, a punishment specifically designed for speech crimes, making it painful and difficult for him to speak the blasphemies he'd been convicted of. Each stage of this punishment was deliberately public. The whipping through streets ensured maximum witnesses. The branding and tongue boring occurred in the town square before a gathered crowd. The permanent nature of the brand meant that for the rest of his life, Naylor would be immediately identifiable as a convicted blasphemer. He could never escape his crime, never fully reintegrate into respectable society. Branding was commonly used for certain offenses. Thieves might be branded on the thumb with a T, adulterers with an A, burglars with a B. These marks served multiple purposes. Permanent record. In an era before criminal databases, a brand provided an indelible record of past offenses. If a branded person committed another crime elsewhere, the brand would reveal their history. Perpetual punishment. The brand ensured that punishment extended far beyond the moment of sentencing. Every social interaction, every business transaction, every appearance in public would remind both the criminal and the community of the past offense. Migration control. The brand made it difficult for criminals to simply move to another community and start over. The mark traveled with them, announcing their past to any new community. Visual deterrence. Seeing branded individuals in daily life provided constant reminders of justice's reach and consequences of transgression. Case Study 4. The Execution of Pirates, Spectacle and Imperial Power, Charleston, South Carolina, 1718. Public executions reached their most elaborate form in piracy cases, which combined criminal justice with displays of imperial authority. The 1718 Charleston execution of Stede Bonnet and his crew provides a dramatic example. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, and 29 members of his crew were captured by Colonel William Rhett and brought to Charleston for trial. The trials themselves were public events, held in venues where townspeople could crowd in to watch. The proceedings were extensively covered in local newspapers and correspondence that spread throughout the colonies and back to England. The executions, carried out over several days in December 1718, were massive public spectacles. They occurred at White Point, at the entrance to Charleston Harbor, a location chosen for maximum visibility both to the gathered crowd and to ships entering the port. The gallows themselves were elaborate structures built to accommodate multiple simultaneous hangings. On December 10, Bonnet was hanged before a crowd estimated at several thousand, a huge gathering in a city of only about 7,000 residents. Over the following weeks, the remaining 29 pirates were executed in groups, each execution drawing large crowds. The pirates' final words were carefully recorded and later published. Their bodies were not immediately buried but were left hanging for extended periods, and some were placed in gibbets, metal cages, at prominent harbor locations where they remained as decaying warnings for months, visible to every ship entering Charleston. These piracy executions served purposes beyond typical criminal punishment. Imperial authority. Pirates threatened British maritime commerce and imperial control. Their executions demonstrated the reach and power of British justice even in colonial peripheries. Economic protection. Charleston's economy depended on maritime trade. The spectacular execution of pirates was designed to reassure merchants and ships, crews that the colony could protect commerce. International messaging. News of the execution spread to other ports, other colonies, and to the Caribbean pirate havens, communicating that piracy would be punished severely. Entertainment. Despite their grim nature, public executions were major social events. People traveled from surrounding areas, took time off work, and treated the day as a significant occasion, part moral instruction, part entertainment, part social gathering. Case Study 5. The Public Whipping of a Slave, Racial Control Through Terror, Virginia, 1740. The brutality of public punishment reached its apex in the treatment of enslaved people, for whom public punishment served the dual purpose of penalizing specific offenses and maintaining racial terror to enforce the system of slavery itself. In 1740, a Virginia county court sentenced an enslaved man named Caesar to a public whipping of 39 lashes for the crime of absenting himself from his master's plantation without a pass. This was not an exceptional case, but a routine one, documented in court records throughout the slaveholding colonies. The whipping occurred at the courthouse on a market day when enslaved and free people from surrounding plantations would be present. Caesar was tied to the whipping post, stripped to the waist, and lashed 39 times with a whip designed to inflict maximum pain and scarring. The punishment was carried out by the county sheriff, with the slaveholder who owned Caesar present, along with other white authorities, and a crowd that included both white colonists and enslaved people who had been specifically required to attend. This mandatory attendance of enslaved people reveals the key purpose. The punishment was designed to terrorize the entire enslaved population into compliance. Every enslaved person watching Caesar's whipping understood that this could be their fate for the smallest infractions. The public nature of the punishment was central to slavery's functioning as a system of racial control. Public punishment of enslaved people differed from punishment of white colonists in crucial ways. Severity. Enslaved people faced more severe punishments for lesser offenses. Minor infractions that might earn a white person a fine resulted in savage whippings for enslaved people. Arbitrariness. While white colonists had some legal protections and trial rights, enslaved people often faced summary punishment at the will of slaveholders or overseers, with public whipping serving to legitimize private violence. Terroristic purpose. The goal wasn't just to punish individual offenders, but to maintain collective fear among all enslaved people, making resistance seem hopeless and submission seem necessary for survival. Racialized spectacle. These punishments reinforced racial hierarchies by displaying black bodies as subject to white violence, with white audiences, including poor whites, united in their privileged position above enslaved people, regardless of their own economic status. The public punishment of enslaved people represents the darkest aspect of colonial public justice, not justice at all, but systemic violence used to maintain an inherently unjust system. Social impact and analysis. The system of public punishment in colonial America shaped society in profound ways that extended far beyond the immediate goal of deterring crime, creating lasting impacts on community structure, social psychology, and cultural values. Community cohesion through collective witnessing. Public punishments functioned as community rituals that brought people together in shared experience. Like religious services or town meetings, execution days and public whippings created moments when the entire community gathered with focused attention. These events reinforced community identity. By collectively witnessing punishment, colonists participated in defining and enforcing community values. However, this cohesion came at the psychological cost of normalizing violence and creating shared trauma, particularly for children who were regularly exposed to brutal spectacles. Reputation economics in small communities. In colonial society where everyone knew everyone, reputation was currency. Public punishment didn't just inflict physical pain, it destroyed social capital. Someone who spent time in the stocks might never fully recover their standing, even after serving their sentence. This made the threat of public punishment extraordinarily powerful, but it also created a harsh, unforgiving society where mistakes could permanently mark individuals. The efficiency of reputation-based punishment in small communities made physical violence seem necessary. Authorities believed deterrence required not just knowledge of consequences, but visceral, memorable experiences that would haunt potential offenders. Psychological impact and socialization of violence. Growing up in a society where public whippings, brandings, and executions were routine family outings fundamentally shaped colonists' psychological relationship with violence. Children learned early that violence was not only acceptable but mandatory for maintaining social order. This normalization had complex effects. It may have contributed to lower violent crime rates by creating powerful deterrents, but it also arguably fostered a more violent culture where corporal punishment of children, servants, and spouses was seen as natural and necessary. The long-term psychological trauma we now associate with witnessing violence simply wasn't recognized. The damage was invisible and therefore ignored. Religious authority and social control. Public punishments were deeply entangled with religious authority, particularly in Puritan New England. Ministers, prominent role in executions, preaching execution sermons, counseling the condemned, publishing last words pamphlets, reinforced the church's social control. Crime was framed as sin, and punishment as divine justice enacted through human authority. This theological framing made questioning the justice system tantamount to questioning God's will, which stifled dissent and reform efforts. It also meant that religious dissenters, Quakers, Baptists, Catholics in Puritan colonies, faced particularly harsh and public punishments, reinforcing religious conformity through terror. The economics of punishment. Public corporal punishment was, in part, a response to economic constraints. Colonial governments lacked resources for extensive prisons or professional law enforcement. Public whipping, stocks, and even execution were cheap compared to long-term incarceration. This economic logic had lasting implications. It meant that wealthy offenders who could pay substantial fines often avoided public humiliation, while poor offenders couldn't buy their way out. The result was a tiered justice system where public punishment increasingly marked class boundaries as well as criminal status. The poor bore their punishment on their bodies, the wealthy paid in currency. Racial terror and systemic oppression. The most devastating impact of public punishment was in maintaining slavery through racialized violence. The systematic public brutalization of enslaved people wasn't about deterring crime. It was about maintaining a labor system built on terror. White colonists, including poor whites with no enslaved people of their own, were united in their privilege to witness and participate in this violence without being subject to it themselves. This created racial identity that transcended class divisions, building white solidarity on the foundation of black subjugation. The legacy of this racialized public violence echoes through centuries of American history, from lynching to modern police brutality. Resistance and defiance. Not all colonists passively accepted the public punishment system. Some convicted criminals used their public platform to challenge authority. Their last words sometimes condemned their judges or questioned the justice of their punishment. Quakers and other religious dissenters deliberately courted public punishment to demonstrate their commitment to their beliefs, turning intended humiliation into martyrdom. Some crowds at executions expressed sympathy for condemned criminals rather than supporting authorities, particularly when the crime seemed minor or the condemned seemed to have been treated unfairly. These moments of resistance suggest that public punishment, while generally effective at maintaining social control, occasionally backfired by creating sympathy for the punished and skepticism toward authority. Modern connections, reflection. The gulf between colonial public punishment and modern American criminal justice seems vast. We hide punishment behind prison walls rather than displaying it in town squares, and we've abolished corporal punishment as criminal penalty. Yet examining colonial public punishment illuminates several contemporary debates and reveals that we haven't entirely abandoned public shaming as a justice tool. The paradox of invisible punishment. Modern America imprisons more people than any nation on earth, yet most citizens never witness this punishment firsthand. Prisons are typically built far from city centers, visits are restricted, and media coverage is limited. This invisibility has paradoxical effects. It may make imprisonment seem more humane because we don't witness the violence and dehumanization it involves, but it also makes it easier to ignore or forget about incarcerated people. Colonial Americans, who witnessed punishment directly, at least couldn't ignore its brutality. Modern Americans can support mass incarceration while remaining ignorant of its reality. Some criminal justice reformers argue that if Americans witnessed prison conditions firsthand, the violence, the solitary confinement, the degradation, public opinion might shift toward reform. Colonial public punishment forced confrontation with justice's brutality. Modern punishment allows comfortable detachment. The return of public shaming. While we've abandoned stocks and pillories, public shaming has returned in new forms through the internet. Doxing, campaigns that publicly identify people accused of wrongdoing, viral videos of alleged crimes or misconduct, online registries of sex offenders with photos and addresses. These function remarkably like colonial public punishment. They seek to deter through visibility, inflict reputational damage, and mark offenders permanently. But unlike colonial punishments, modern online shaming often happens without due process, is permanent in digital form, and can go viral globally rather than reaching just a local community. We've recreated some of colonial punishment's worst features: mob justice, permanent marking, no opportunity for redemption, without the legal oversight that at least theoretically accompanied colonial public punishment. Deterrence theory and its limits. Colonial authorities firmly believed that witnessing punishment deterred crime. Modern criminology has largely debunked simple deterrence theory. Research consistently shows that certainty of punishment matters far more than severity, and that witnessing brutal punishment doesn't reliably reduce crime. Yet American criminal justice policy still often operates on colonial-era assumptions, particularly in capital punishment debates. Supporters argue that executions, even though they're now semi-private, deter murder, despite extensive research showing no deterrent effect. The emotional appeal of making an example of criminals remains powerful, even as evidence suggests it doesn't work as intended. Colonial Americans at least had an excuse for believing in deterrence through spectacular punishment. They lacked modern criminological research. We have that research and often ignore it. The spectacle of punishment in media. While we've moved executions behind prison walls and limited attendance to small groups of official witnesses, we've replaced the physical crowd with media spectacle. High-profile trials are broadcast live, creating audiences of millions rather than hundreds. True crime documentaries endlessly rehash cases, focusing on grisly details. Media coverage of violent crime shapes public perception of crime rates far more than actual crime statistics. The execution of Timothy McVeigh in 2001 was broadcast via closed-circuit television to survivors and victims, families, a modern version of public execution's emotional theater. We've changed the technology, but perhaps not the underlying human fascination with witnessing punishment. Restorative justice as alternative. Some modern justice reform movements explicitly reject the public shaming model in favor of restorative justice approaches that occur in private, involve offenders, victims, and community in dialogue aimed at repair rather than punishment. These approaches represent a fundamental philosophical departure from colonial public punishment. They assume that community healing comes not from witnessing an offender's suffering, but from facilitating accountability, understanding, and repair. It's notable that this represents a return to some pre-colonial indigenous justice practices, suggesting that the colonial European model wasn't the only option even in earlier eras. Racial justice and public violence. The colonial legacy of racialized public violence most directly connects to modern debates about police brutality and racial justice. The public nature of police killings of Black Americans, captured on video, shared widely, discussed nationally, eerily echoes the spectacle of colonial and antebellum racial terror. The videos serve different purposes for different audiences. For some, they're evidence demanding reform. For others, they function almost like the public punishments that once maintained racial hierarchies. The trauma that Black communities experience from repeatedly witnessing these deaths parallels the terroristic function of public punishment of enslaved people. It communicates vulnerability and maintains fear. Understanding this historical continuity is essential to addressing contemporary racial injustice. Conclusion and call to action. The colonial system of public punishment, with its whipping posts, stocks, pillories, brandings, and executions carried out before crowds of adults and children, strikes modern Americans as barbaric. And it was barbaric, particularly in its racial dimensions where public violence was weaponized to maintain slavery's terror. Yet colonial authorities didn't view themselves as cruel or sadistic. They genuinely believed that public punishment served essential social functions, deterring crime through fear, instructing communities about moral boundaries, maintaining order in societies with minimal law enforcement infrastructure, and performing community cohesion through collective witnessing of justice. The effectiveness of these goals is debatable. Public punishment may have contributed to relatively low crime rates in colonial communities, though low crime probably owed more to small community size, limited anonymity, and strong social networks than to fear of the whipping post. The spectacle of punishment certainly communicated power, both legitimate governmental authority and, in slavery's case, illegitimate racial domination. And these events undeniably shaped colonial culture, creating societies where violence was normalized, where reputation could be destroyed by single mistakes, and where conformity was enforced through fear as much as through community belonging. What we've lost in moving punishment behind prison walls is confrontation with justice's reality. Colonial Americans couldn't ignore that punishment meant physical suffering. They witnessed it directly. Modern Americans can support punishment policies without ever confronting what punishment actually entails. There's something to be said for forcing societies to witness what they sanction, though obviously not through returning to public whipping or execution. What we've gained is a more humane system in many respects, one that at least officially recognizes rehabilitation as a goal, limits cruel punishment, and provides some due process protections. But we've also created new problems. Mass incarceration that disproportionately affects communities of color, punishment hidden from public view that enables abuse, and digital public shaming that combines colonial stocks, reputation destruction with modern technologies, permanent record, and global reach. The challenge is finding a balance, acknowledging that complete publicity of punishment had serious costs, trauma, normalization of violence, reputational destruction, while recognizing that complete invisibility also has costs, enabling mass incarceration, disconnecting punishment from public accountability, allowing comfortable ignorance of justice system brutality. Perhaps the answer lies not in making punishment more public, but in making justice more public, transparency about prison conditions, community involvement in restorative justice processes, and public dialogue about what we actually hope punishment achieves. Colonial public punishment was designed to make onlookers uncomfortable, to force them to confront crime's consequences. Perhaps discomfort is something we need more of, not through returning to brutal spectacle, but through honestly confronting our modern justice system's realities. What do you think? Does hiding punishment behind prison walls make it more humane or just more ignorable? Should modern justice include more public accountability, or would that slide toward the colonial errors of public shaming and spectacle? How do we balance punishment's necessary unpleasantness with human dignity? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this exploration of colonial justice thought-provoking, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into American history's uncomfortable realities, the practices that shaped our society and the questions they still raise. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical investigation. And if you believe these conversations matter, please like and share this video to keep the discussion going. Understanding where we came from, including the brutal parts, is essential to deciding where we should go. Thanks for watching and thinking alongside us.